How to recognize the different categories of type. We're going to start with serifs. Old style is the first category. Notice the diagonal stress happening right here. How it's thinner in this area at a diagonal, and it's thicker on the sides. And the stroke transition is really important, that you recognize the fact that that's one of the ways we recognize, that's how we recognize typefaces, is that some have a moderate thick to thin transition, and this is one of those. And the old style has that, has a thick to thin transition in it, but it's moderate. It's not too extreme. The serifs are these little marks right here, and notice that on an old style font, the serif has a diagonal line. It's at a diagonal. And that's how you recognize it. And here are some examples here, right down there. These are all fonts that are traditional serifs. These guys you've been looking at your whole life. Every time you read a book, you're normally reading old style. I wanted to point out brackets to you. Some serif typefaces are bracketed and some aren't. So this is how you recognize them. If you look up here, the old style serif has a bracket. This is what a bracket looks like. It's this little blue mark right here. These are brackets. If it doesn't have a bracket, then it's considered not bracketed. Here's an example. A modern serif has no brackets. See that? There's no curve going on right there. So that's how you recognize this is a modern font. In addition to the fact there's a vertical stress rather than the diagonal we looked at with the old style. And notice that the lowercase letters, the actual serif itself is not at a slant, unlike its predecessor where it's at a slant and this is at a diagonal. These are really definite ways to identify the difference between modern and old style, aren't they? And last but not least, one of the main ways I recognize it is the radical thick to thin transition in the strokes. And here are some examples here. My first typographic experience was creating an article for a newspaper. Well, it wasn't my first experience, but it was one of my first professional ones. And I chose Bodini as the font for the paper. And I remember it looking terrible because of the fact that the stroke got so thin that it would disappear on the paper, because I had the point size down to like 8 or 9 points because the client really wanted me to cram everything in there. And I realized that I needed something with a little bit less drastic transitions in the strokes in order for it to appear in the paper, because of the way the paper is printed, which is ink spreads when it hits the paper, when it hits a traditional paper. This is just the definition from the Type Rules book. These illustrations are straight out of the non-designer's book, just so you know. So slab serifs, how do you recognize these? Well, these have very little thick to thin transition. Of course, they have the thick slabs, and the slabs are squared off. They're not at diagonal, and they've got a vertical stress. So they're pretty easy to recognize. So let's go ahead and go back through these really quick. I'm just going to go up and take a look. How would I recognize an old style font? Well, the diagonal serifs are a giveaway. The diagonal stress is a giveaway. And traditionally, there's not a lot of there's a kind of moderate amount of thick to thin transition. And of course, it's got the curved brackets. Modern font, radical thick to thin transition, vertical stress, and the serifs themselves are flat. Again, they're not at an angle. Slab serifs, great big fat square serifs. The font itself is going to be a lot bolder. There's less thick to thin transition going on than the other two, and of course the vertical stress. All right, and this is the book definition for slab serif. By the way, notice that there's no bracketing on a slab serif, which this doesn't illustrate, but it's important to notice that actually this serif does have a bracket. Take a look at this, which contradicts, I suppose, a little bit with what the book is saying. I want to clarify there will be contradictions, that there was never any meeting among typographers to decide any definitive categories. So really every book in some ways is somewhat making it up. Yes, there's people that are high up in the type world that people respect their opinion, but basically you got to allow for a little bit of fluidity in your understanding of these terms. I don't think you'd argue that this is a slab serif and that that's a slab serif, but they do have different qualities. This one right here has a more rounded quality to it, and this one's more squared off, but they are both slab serifs. They can also be called square serifs, just so you know. All right, here's sans serifs. So let's switch over from serifs to sans serif. The word sans means no. We're going to talk about these four. So first off, let's just analyze the sans serifs in general. There's no serifs. That's the big way to recognize them. And if a student can't recognize the difference between a serif and a sans serif, I'm really disappointed, because it's the very base level of typography. So no serif on this guy. There's very little thick to thin transition. So sans serifs traditionally don't look like that old style typeface that have that thick to thin transition going on. And there's no stress. There's not diagonal or vertical. There's just no stress. So that's a traditional sans serif. But it does break down into different categories, which we're going to talk about right now. So 19th century grotesque. Really, the best way to recognize this, it's just a traditional sans serif. And the book says this. It's a little bit of a trick when you do your homework assignment. It's just the double G, or the like it says here, the double bull, 2-story. So take a look at that G. Look for that G. That's how you recognize 19th century grotesque when you're picking one out. In the 20th century, it's really not much different than the 19th, except for the fact that the G is open. So you got this open tongue going on right here. So that single bold G is a great way to recognize it. The other way to recognize it, according to the descriptions, if you read these guys right here, is the stroke weight. The stroke weight on the 19th century, as you can see, is thicker. And the stroke weight on the 20th is thinner. Again, fonts come in families, but we're talking about the regular base copy category, which is just where literally just regular, not bold, not condensed, not italic, but regular is what we're looking at. All right, so I just look at the G for homework purposes. Just look at the G if you want to separate these two. Next, you got geometric. Geometric is pretty simple to recognize. Basically, there's no thick to thin transition in the strokes. It's all what's called mono width, single width in the strokes, and the O is perfect. Now, if you go read on this online, geometric, you're going to find some contradictions. I'm just going to warn you about that. But for the purpose of the homework assignment and just going off the book, let's just look for perfect circles for geometric. But at times students pick something else out that does fit other people's criteria for geometric that I've read, and I'll have some flexibility there. But this class is supposed to be book-based, so pay attention to the non-designer's book and the type rules book. And the other stuff you find off the internet, you know, I'm not saying it's wrong. Like I told you, that this whole thing is a little bit fluid, and right and wrong gets a little bit sketchy when it comes down to details like this. But based off the book, look for perfect circles. Backing up, take a look at these circles. These guys aren't perfect. These are definitely ovals, and this O is a circle. And notice the circle are in the P, and the Q, in the G, and how these don't have that. They're not perfect circles. So that's how you recognize geometric. Geometric really is modern and cool looking, I'll tell you what. And that's how you recognize it. And then you got humanistic. Humanistic is a blend of sans serifs and serifs. The best way to recognize it is just the thick to thin transition. Sans serifs, we already established, traditionally do not have any or have very little stroke transition. But this is the exception. Humanistic is an attempt to blend serifs and sans serifs together. So there is no serif, so it's definitely a no serif. but it has that strong thick to thin transition, and that's how you recognize a humanistic font. A humanistic sans serif is what you would call it. All right, let's talk about scripts. Really, let's just talk about formal and brush. These are really easy to understand, I think. I feel they are. So, scripts. What does a formal script look like? By the way, in general, scripts just look like they're handwritten. They look like calligraphy, or they look like they're just handwriting. Formal script looks like beautiful calligraphy. That's what it looks like. Look right here in front of me. It looks like something you'd see on a wedding invitation. It's flourished. It's beautiful. It's got a lot of strong thick to thin transition. It looks very romantic, and it just looks like excellent penmanship. And then you've got casual brush script, which just looks like, it can look like something you wrote with a Sharpie, or that you wrote with a pen to leave a note for your significant other or for a friend. It's much more fun. It feels a lot more, it doesn't feel elegant as much as it does kind of informal and personal, which is why there was a time it stopped. I haven't seen it in a while, but there was a time about 10 years ago where a lot of software companies were trying to use scripts because they didn't want people to think of them as being some cold, unthinking computer company. But they went back to the more to sans serifs pretty quickly, because sans serifs feel more modern, which is another conversation that we can have at a different time. I digress. Let's move on. So the difference is beautiful, formal, and informal and fun. But these are both scripts. They look handwritten, period. And there's another category the book talks about, just handwriting, which is a little bit different than casual, because this looks like it's done with this example here you're looking at for casual brush looks like it's done with an actual brush. Handwriting looks like it's done more with a pen, and looks even more informal than brush script. So basically, this is simply super fancy down to not fancy at all. Miscellaneous. Black letter. Black letter is one that I put in its own section just because of the fact it really is beautiful. It has great history. You might think of it just as something that reminds you of medieval times, back in the day, in the Dark Ages. But the reason you think that is because of the fact that when the Gutenberg Bible came out, and none of us were around back then, it was actually in black letters. So the original expensive, beautiful books of way back when were actually in black letter. This is only rich people could afford it, or you could go into a church and you could see it. But this is a big, beautiful typeface, which is recognized by how thick it is and how beautiful it is. Then you have decorative. Decorative is the catch-all category. I want to say something about decorative that's a big deal in this particular class. This typeface right here, where it says decorative at the top, this is a decorative sans serif because there's no serifs. See, and there's no thick to thin transition. So I can actually categorize it. This guy right here, if you take a look at it, even though it's all caps, this is definitely a serif. And if you look how it's squared off at the top and not at an angle, that this is closer to a modern sans or a modern serif when you take a look at it. It can be categorized, but it's beat up. So it's a decorative serif is what I would call it. And I can continue to go through this, and I can actually categorize some of these. This is obviously a sans serif. This looks like, this is not a sans, this is sort of a sans serif, but it has these little embellishments here. So it's a mix of, script and a serif. This right here is kind of like a humanistic sans serif. As you can see, I can categorize these. This one here is really hard to categorize, though. There are certain ones that are. I mean, if you find a font that's made out of cats, it's just decorative. But I do want to specify that that I don't like hearing just decorative if you could have very easily taken the next step and told me it's a decorative serif, a decorative sans serif, a decorative script, a decorative slab serif. If you can, the more you can break it down in your write-ups and your descriptions that you submit your assignments in, the better. But decorative really is a catch-all crazy category. Basically, whether it's the font for the matrix or there's a million of them out there. In fact, if you go to any free font website, most of them are just filled with one-off, crazy-looking typefaces that would fall in the category of decorative. You'd never use them for body copy for like a newspaper article or something like that, but you might use them for headings because they have a lot of personality. So I hope that you learned a lot through this video, and that it helps you understand how you can actually recognize the different categories of type. And I highly suggest that, in addition to taking the quiz this week, that you get into your non-designer's book and you literally take the quiz at the end of the chapter on type categories that will allow you to that'll test your ability to recognize. If you can't recognize, but by the end of this class, and moving forward in your career as a designer, you should be able to recognize font categories, type categories, and classify them. So because it's so important in making your decisions. I'll give you this short summary of why. Sans serifs are more modern. So if you're doing something for a modern business, choose a sans serif. Serifs are more classic. So if you're doing something where you want a more classic feel, then you choose a serif. And if you want to, and scripts are more humanistic. They have a more human quality to them, whether it be a fancy wedding feel or just an informal, fun feel. They're great for giving you that down-to-earth feel, like a children's book or something like that. But basically, knowing the category is not just a technical thing; it's a creative thing, and and that's why we're learning about categories this week. Once again, I hope you found this helpful.